How dare you touch that? Leave this room right now!
Darling, she's just a child.
This was supposed to be a perfect dinner, until the maid's little girl spoke. Inside the billionaire's mansion, a long dining table was filled with rich guests, shining glasses, and expensive food nobody even touched twice. Near the door stood a poor maid, holding her 3-year-old daughter's hand, trying to stay invisible like she always did. But the little girl kept staring at one empty chair at the head of the table. The billionaire's fiancé noticed her and smiled coldly. "She doesn't belong here," she said loudly, making sure every guest could hear. "Take that child back to the kitchen before she embarrasses us." The maid's face turned pale. She lowered her eyes, ready to apologize. But before she could speak, her little daughter stepped forward, pointed at the empty chair, and said, "But the old man in the picture told Mommy this seat was hers." The billionaire froze, his fork stopped in midair. Because that empty chair had belonged to his dead father, and nobody knew his father had left one secret letter behind, a letter with the maid's name written inside. This was supposed to be a perfect dinner, until the maid's little girl spoke. Hawthorne Manor had never looked more beautiful than it did that evening. The long dining hall glowed under crystal chandeliers, gold candles burned beside white roses, and 20 rich guests sat around a table so polished it reflected their faces like water. Silver forks, crystal glasses, silk napkins, and plates painted with gold edges filled every place setting. Everything looked perfect. But near the dining room door, Leela Monroe stood with her 3-year-old daughter's hand in hers, praying no one would notice them. Lila was 27 years old, a young black woman with tired eyes, soft curls tied behind her head, and a black maid's dress that had been washed so many times the fabric had started to fade at the sleeves. She had worked at Hawthorne Manor for almost 4 years. She cleaned the rooms no guest ever thanked her for. She polished the floors people walked across without looking down. She carried trays into rooms where powerful people spoke as if she were not even human enough to hear them. But Lila never complained, not because it didn't hurt, because she had a daughter to feed. Her little girl, Rosie, was only 3. She had deep brown skin, big curious eyes, tiny braids tied with white ribbons, and a way of staring at people that made adults uncomfortable, as if she could see the feelings they were trying to hide. Tonight, Rosie was supposed to be in the back kitchen with Mrs. Bell, the older cook, but Mrs. Bell had burned her hand while preparing dinner, and Rosie had started crying after being left alone too long. So Lila had taken her quietly to the dining room door, hoping to finish serving the last course and slip away before anyone noticed. But someone did notice: Cassandra Vale, the billionaire's fiancée. Cassandra sat beside Ethan Hawthorne at the center of the table in a deep red silk dress, her blonde hair falling perfectly over one shoulder, a diamond necklace glittering against her neck. She was beautiful in a cold way, the kind of beauty that made people admire her before they understood her. Everyone called her the perfect future Mrs. Hawthorne. The staff called her cruel, but only when no one important was near. She had arrived in Ethan's life 8 months earlier, and since then Hawthorne Manor had changed. The warm kitchen laughter became whispers, staff breaks became shorter, mistakes became dangerous. Cassandra hated fingerprints on glass, children in hallways, and anyone who reminded her that wealth did not make a person kind. And she hated Rosie most of all, not because Rosie was loud, she wasn't, not because Rosie broke things, she never did. Cassandra hated the way Ethan smiled whenever Rosie passed him a crooked drawing. She hated the way the little girl once called him Mr. Ethan and asked why he looked sad. She hated how that small child could soften a man Cassandra had worked so hard to control. That evening's dinner was important. It was not just a family dinner, it was the first official dinner after Ethan and Cassandra's engagement announcement. Business partners, family friends, and 2 members of Ethan's late father's legal board had been invited. Cassandra wanted everyone to see her sitting beside Ethan like she already owned the mansion. At the head of the table, one chair remained empty. It was a tall wooden chair with carved arms, placed slightly apart from the others. No one sat there, no one even touched it. That chair had belonged to Arthur Hawthorne, Ethan's father, the man who built the Hawthorne name and died 6 months before Cassandra entered the house. Every formal dinner, Ethan kept that chair empty, out of respect, out of grief, out of a promise he had made to himself that his father's place would never be filled by someone unworthy. Rosie kept staring at that chair. At first Lila thought her daughter was just curious. Children noticed strange things: empty chairs, flickering candles, paintings on the wall, but Rosie's eyes were fixed on that seat with a seriousness too heavy for a 3-year-old. "Rosie," Lila whispered, bending slightly. "Look at Mommy." Rosie didn't move. "Baby, please." At the table, laughter rose as one of the guests made a joke. Ethan smiled politely, though his eyes looked tired. He was 34 years old, tall, quiet, powerful, and lonely in a way Lila recognized because she had seen the same loneliness in herself. He had never treated her badly. That was the strange thing. Men like Ethan could be cruel without consequence, but he wasn't. He always said thank you. He remembered Rosie's name. Once, when Lila had dropped a tray and nearly cried from fear, he had helped her pick up the broken glass himself and told her, "It's only a tray." That kindness had stayed with her longer than it should have. Cassandra lifted her glass and smiled at the guests. "To new beginnings," she said sweetly, "and to family." Everyone raised their glasses. Leela lowered her eyes, ready to step back into the hallway. Then Rosie tugged her hand. "Mommy," she whispered, "why is that chair empty?" The dining room was quiet enough for the nearest guests to hear. Leela's stomach dropped. "Rosie," she whispered quickly, "not now." But Cassandra had already turned, her smile faded. "What is that child doing here?" she asked. The table went silent. Leela's face burned. "I'm sorry, Miss Vale. Mrs. Bell was hurt in the kitchen, and Rosie was only here for a moment. I'll take her back right away." Cassandra leaned back in her chair and looked Rosie up and down, from her white ribbons to her tiny shoes. "She doesn't belong here," Cassandra said. The words were calm, but they cut through the room. Leela's throat tightened. "Yes, ma'am, I understand." "No," Cassandra said louder, making sure every guest heard. "I don't think you do. This is a private family dinner. Not a place for staff children to wander in and stare at things they have no right to ask about." Rosie moved closer to her mother's leg. Ethan's fork stopped halfway to his plate. "Cassandra," he said quietly. But Cassandra kept going, smiling now as if she were teaching a lesson. "Take that child back to the kitchen where she came from." Leela lowered her eyes, humiliation burning behind them. She had heard insults before. She had swallowed them because rent was due, because groceries cost money, because pride did not pay for preschool. But Rosie looked up at Cassandra, confused. Then she looked at the empty chair again, and in her small voice she said, "But the old man in the picture told Mommy this chair was hers." Every sound in the dining room disappeared. Ethan froze. His face changed so suddenly that the glass in his hand trembled. "What did she say?" he whispered. Leela's blood went cold. Cassandra's smile vanished. Rosie pointed toward the portrait hanging above the fireplace. Arthur Hawthorne's portrait. "The man there," Rosie said. "He told Mommy this was her chair." Leela grabbed her daughter's hand. "Rosie, stop." But Ethan was already standing. His eyes moved from Rosie to Leela, then to his father's empty chair. Because 3 nights before Arthur Hawthorne died, he had asked Leela to come into his study. And he had given her a sealed letter. A letter she had never opened. A letter with Ethan's name written on the front. And the moment Rosie spoke, Leela realized the secret she had buried for 6 months had just been dragged into the light. The dining room went so quiet that Lila could hear the candle flames flicker. Rosie stood beside her mother's skirt, one tiny hand still pointing at Arthur Hawthorne's portrait above the fireplace. She did not understand why every adult at the table had suddenly stopped moving. She did not understand why her mother's hand had gone cold. She only knew she had said something true. The old man in the picture had told Mommy the chair was hers. That was all, but to Ethan Hawthorne, those words felt like the floor had shifted beneath him. He stared at Rosie, then at Lila. "What letter?" he asked. Lila's lips parted, but no sound came out. Cassandra stood so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. "This is ridiculous," she said, forcing a laugh. "Ethan, she is 3 years old, children make things up. She probably heard some kitchen gossip and turned it into a fairy tale." Rosie's eyebrows pulled together. "I don't lie." A few guests looked down at their plates, uncomfortable. Cassandra's eyes sharpened. "No one asked you to speak." Lila immediately stepped in front of her daughter. "Please, Miss Vale, she's only a child." "Then teach her to behave like one." Ethan's voice cut through the room. "Cassandra, enough." The table froze again. Cassandra turned to him, shocked. Ethan rarely corrected her in public. He hated scenes. He hated raised voices. He had spent most of his life learning how to keep pain private, especially after his father's death. But now his eyes were fixed on Lila. "Lila," he said carefully, "did my father give you a letter?" Lila felt every guest staring at her. Business partners, family friends, lawyers, people who could destroy her with one phone call. Her face burned, but her chest felt hollow with fear. "Yes," she whispered. Ethan took one step toward her. "When?" Lila swallowed. 3 nights before he passed. A murmur moved around the table. Cassandra's face went pale for only a second before anger covered it. "You never told us this," she snapped. Lila lowered her eyes. "Mr. Arthur told me not to say anything until the right time." Cassandra laughed coldly. "The right time? And what exactly does that mean?" "A maid gets to decide when a billionaire family receives private documents." Lila flinched. Ethan noticed. His jaw tightened. "Where is it?" he asked. Lila looked at Rosie, then back at him. "In my room." Cassandra stepped forward. "How convenient." Ethan turned to one of the staff near the door. "Mrs. Bell, please ask security to escort Lila to her quarters and bring the letter here." "No," Cassandra said sharply. Everyone looked at her. She softened immediately, placing a hand over her chest like she was wounded. "I mean, Ethan, think about this. Your father's legal board is here. Your guests are here. This is supposed to be our family dinner. Do you really want to turn it into some dramatic little performance because a toddler pointed at a chair?" Rosie whispered, "It's Mommy's chair." Cassandra's eyes flashed. Ethan did not look away from Lila. "I want the letter." Lila nodded quickly, grateful and terrified at the same time. She picked Rosie up in her arms, but Cassandra stepped into her path. "You expect us to believe Arthur Hawthorne gave you something important?" Cassandra said, her voice low enough to sound controlled, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "You cleaned his study, you served his tea, that is all." Lila's eyes filled, but she said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was safer than defending herself. But Rosie lifted her head from her mother's shoulder. "Grandpa Arthur liked Mommy," she said softly. The room stirred. Ethan's face changed. "Grandpa Arthur?" he repeated. Lila closed her eyes. That name had slipped from Rosie's mouth like a match falling into dry grass. Cassandra smiled slowly, sensing weakness. "Oh," she said. "So now your daughter is calling my fiancé's father Grandpa?" Lila shook her head. "She was little. Mr. Arthur used to let her sit in the library when I cleaned. He told her stories sometimes, that's all." Cassandra's voice rose. "A staff child sitting in the family library with Arthur Hawthorne?" Ethan looked at Lila, but there was no anger in his face, only confusion, memory, pain. "My father never let anyone into that library," he said. Lila's voice broke. "He let Rosie in." For a moment Ethan looked back at the empty chair. His father's chair. He remembered Arthur Hawthorne as strict, distant, impossible to impress. A man who spoke in decisions, not emotions. After his mother died, Arthur had become even colder. Ethan had spent years trying to earn warmth from him and rarely succeeded. But now he was hearing that the old man had allowed a maid's little girl into his private library, had told her stories, had given her mother a letter, had possibly left behind something Ethan was never told. Mrs. Bell entered quietly from the hallway, her burned hand wrapped in a towel. "I can take Miss Lila," she said. Lila moved toward the door, but Cassandra grabbed her arm. Not hard enough for everyone to call it violence, but hard enough for Lila to stop. "Be careful," Cassandra whispered. "If this is some trick, you'll regret it." Ethan saw her fingers on Lila's arm. "Let her go." Cassandra released her immediately. Lila carried Rosie out with Mrs. Bell beside her. The hallway felt colder than usual. Each step toward the staff quarters made her heart beat faster. "Mama," Rosie whispered, "did I do bad?" Lila kissed her forehead. "No, baby." "Then why is the Red Lady mad?" Lila almost laughed through her tears. "Red Lady?" Cassandra in her red silk dress, burning with anger because a child had said what adults were afraid to ask. "Because some people get scared when the truth comes out," Lila whispered. In their small room behind the laundry hall, Lila opened the bottom drawer of her dresser. Under folded uniforms and old bills, beneath a small photograph of Rosie as a baby, lay the sealed envelope. It was thick, cream-colored and still untouched. On the front, in Arthur Hawthorne's handwriting, were 3 words, "For my son." Lila's hands trembled as she picked it up. She remembered that night clearly. Arthur had been sitting in his study, weaker than usual, a blanket over his knees, his breathing heavy. He had asked her to close the door. Then he handed her the envelope and said, "Lila, there are things my son does not know. Things I should have told him before pride made a prison out of this house." She had not understood. He had looked toward little Rosie sleeping on the library sofa and smiled in a way Lila had never seen before. "When the right time comes," he had said, "give this to Ethan. You'll know when." For 6 months, Lila had waited. She had almost given it to Ethan after the funeral, but Cassandra had already begun appearing at the mansion, watching everything, controlling everything, making Lila feel like one wrong move could cost her the only job she had. So Lila kept the letter hidden. Now the right time had arrived through the mouth of a 3-year-old child. When Lila returned to the dining room, the guests were still seated, but dinner had been forgotten. Ethan stood beside his father's empty chair. Cassandra stood near him, arms crossed, her smile gone. Lila walked forward and held out the envelope. Ethan took it slowly. His fingers brushed the handwriting. "For my son." The room held its breath. Cassandra stepped closer. "Ethan, maybe you should read it privately." But Ethan was already opening it. Inside was one folded page and a small old photograph. The photograph slipped out first. It landed face up on the table. Ethan stared at it. So did everyone else, close enough to see. It showed Arthur Hawthorne years ago, younger, standing beside a black woman holding a baby girl. On the back, written in faded ink, was a name: Lila. Ethan's face went pale. Lila covered her mouth, confused and trembling. Cassandra whispered, "What is this?" Ethan unfolded the letter. His eyes moved across the first line. Then he stopped breathing, because the first sentence said, "Ethan, before I die, you must know the truth about Lila Monroe. She is not just the maid in this house. Ethan, before I die, you must know the truth about Lila Monroe. She is not just the maid in this house." Ethan read the line again, then again. The words did not change. His hand tightened around the letter, but his eyes moved to the photograph lying on the table. His father, younger and softer looking than Ethan remembered, stood beside a black woman with kind eyes. In her arms was a baby girl. On the back was one name: Lila. The dining room felt frozen. Lila stood near the door, one hand over her mouth, Rosie pressed against her side. She could not understand what she was seeing. She knew nothing about that photograph. She had never seen Arthur Hawthorne young. She had never seen the woman beside him, and yet the baby in that picture had her name. Cassandra was the first to speak. "This is nonsense," she said sharply. "That letter could be anything: a dying man's confusion, a mistake, some old servant's story." Ethan did not look at her. He kept reading. His father's handwriting was shaky but clear. "Years before your mother and I married, I loved a woman named Elise Monroe. I was young, proud, and too cowardly to fight my family for her. When she became pregnant, my father threatened to destroy her life unless I walked away. I chose fear. It is the shame I carried longer than any business failure, longer than any grief." Ethan's face lost all color. Lila took a step back. "No," she whispered. Rosie looked up at her. "Mommy?" Ethan continued, his voice now barely above a whisper, but loud enough for the whole table to hear. "Elise raised our daughter alone. I searched for them years later, but by the time I found the truth, Elise had passed away. Lila was already grown, working to survive, unaware of who her father was. When she came to this house as staff, I recognized her only after seeing her mother's locket around her neck." Lila's hand went to her chest. Under her maid uniform, hidden beneath the white collar, was a small gold locket her mother had left her. She had worn it every day of her life. Ethan looked at it, his eyes filled with something between grief and disbelief. "My father knew," he whispered. Lila shook her head slowly, tears already falling. "I didn't. I swear, I didn't know any of this." "I believe you," Ethan said immediately. That answer made Cassandra's jaw tighten. Ethan read the final paragraph. "I have changed my will. Lila Monroe is my daughter. She is to be recognized legally and publicly, with her daughter Rosie protected under the Hawthorne family trust. The chair at my table is hers if she ever chooses to sit in it. Ethan, I failed her as a father. Do not fail her as a brother." The room went completely silent. Brother. The word struck harder than any accusation. Ethan lowered the letter, staring at Lila as if seeing her for the first time and recognizing something that had always been there. The quiet dignity, the same stubborn softness his father had hidden under years of pride. Even Rosie's fearless little eyes suddenly reminded him of the way Arthur Hawthorne used to look across a boardroom when he had already made up his mind. Lila looked like she might collapse. Mrs. Bell hurried to her side, but Lila held up one trembling hand. "No," Lila whispered. "This can't be right. My mother never told me." Ethan's voice softened. "Maybe she was protecting you." "From what?" Lila asked, broken. Before Ethan could answer, Cassandra laughed. It was not a pretty laugh anymore. It was sharp, panicked, ugly. "Oh, how touching. The maid is suddenly family because of one letter? Are all of you insane?" Ethan turned toward her slowly. Cassandra pointed at Lila. "Look at her. She has worked here for years. If Arthur truly believed she was his daughter, why didn't he announce it before he died? Why hide it? Why give the letter to her like some dramatic little fairy tale?" "Because he was afraid," Ethan said. "Or because it's fake." One of the older men at the table, Mr. Whitmore, Arthur's longtime attorney, cleared his throat. "It is not fake." Everyone turned. Cassandra's face changed. Mr. Whitmore stood carefully, his expression heavy. "Arthur came to my office 2 weeks before his death. He changed his will. He also ordered a DNA report using a preserved medical sample from Elise Monroe's old records and one from Lila's employment health file." Lila gasped softly. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "You knew?" Mr. Whitmore looked ashamed. "I was instructed to wait until Arthur's private letter was delivered. He believed Miss Monroe deserved to hear the truth from family, not from lawyers." Cassandra gripped the back of a chair. "And you never thought to mention this before tonight?" she snapped. Mr. Whitmore looked directly at her. "I tried." Cassandra went still. Ethan caught it. "What does that mean?" he asked. Mr. Whitmore hesitated. Cassandra forced a smile. "He's old, Ethan. He's confused." But Mr. Whitmore reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a second envelope. 3 months ago, I sent a sealed notice to the estate office requesting a meeting about Arthur's amended will. The notice disappeared before Ethan received it." Ethan's eyes moved to Cassandra. She swallowed. Mr. Whitmore continued. 2 weeks later, Miss Vale visited my office and asked whether old amendments could be challenged if they were based on emotional instability near death." The room stirred. Cassandra's perfect mask cracked. "That was a legal question," she said quickly. "I was protecting Ethan." "Protecting me from my sister?" Ethan asked. The word sister made Lila cover her mouth as another sob escaped. Rosie looked between them, confused. "Mommy has a brother?" Ethan's face softened. He walked toward Rosie and knelt slowly in front of her. "I think she does," he said. Rosie looked serious. "Then Mommy can sit in the chair?" Ethan looked back at his father's empty seat, then at Cassandra. "Yes," he said quietly, "she can." Cassandra slammed her hand on the table. "No, absolutely not. You cannot let this woman walk in here and take everything your father built." Ethan stood. "She isn't walking in," he said coldly. "She's been here for 4 years, cleaning the house that was already partly hers." Cassandra's face burned red. Lila shook her head, overwhelmed. "I don't want anything. I never came here for money. I didn't even know." "I know," Ethan said gently. Then he turned back to Cassandra. "But you knew enough to be afraid of her." Cassandra opened her mouth, but no words came, and in that moment, Ethan finally understood. Cassandra had not hated Rosie because she was a staff child. She had hated Rosie because the little girl kept wandering too close to a secret Cassandra had been trying to bury. And before the night was over, the whole table would learn just how far Cassandra had gone to keep Lila from that chair. Cassandra's silence told Ethan everything. For months, she had smiled at his side, planned their wedding, chosen flowers for rooms she did not own, and quietly worked to erase the one person Arthur Hawthorne had tried to bring back into the family. Mr. Whitmore placed another document on the table. "This is the amended will," he said. "Arthur left Lila a legal share of the estate, a trust for Rosie, and full recognition as his daughter. He also requested that Ethan be the first person to welcome her." Ethan's eyes filled with pain. Not because of the money, because his father had carried this secret alone until death. Lila stepped back, shaking her head. "No, I don't want to take anything from you." Ethan turned to her immediately. "You're not taking anything. You're receiving what he should have given you years ago." Cassandra laughed bitterly. "Listen to her act innocent. She's been standing in this house for 4 years, waiting for this moment." Lila's face crumpled. "I didn't know." "She didn't," Ethan said coldly. But you did. Cassandra's eyes flashed. I protected you. You hid my father's letter. You blocked the lawyer's notice. You humiliated a 3-year-old child because she stood near a chair you were afraid her mother might claim. The room was silent. Rosie looked up at Ethan, then at the empty chair. Can Mommy sit now? She asked softly. That tiny question broke something in Lila. For years she had stood beside tables like this, serving food she never tasted, hearing laughter she was never invited into, watching people treat her daughter like she was something to hide. And now her little girl was asking for permission to sit in a chair that had belonged to her own grandfather. Ethan walked to the head of the table and pulled the chair back. Then he looked at Lila. This seat is yours if you want it. Lila's tears fell silently. I don't know how to be part of a family like this. Ethan's voice softened. Neither do I, but maybe we can learn. Mrs. Bell began crying near the doorway. Even some of the guests lowered their eyes, ashamed of how easily they had believed Cassandra and ignored Lila. Cassandra grabbed her purse. This is humiliating, she hissed. Ethan looked at her one last time. No, Cassandra. Humiliating a child was humiliating. This is truth. By morning, Cassandra was gone from Hawthorne Manor. The engagement ended quietly, but the story did not. Mr. Whitmore filed Arthur's documents in court, and within weeks, Lila Monroe was legally recognized as Lila Hawthorne Monroe, Arthur's daughter and Ethan's sister. But the biggest change was not in papers, it was in the house. Lila no longer entered the dining room through the side door. Rosie no longer waited in kitchens. At the next family dinner, Ethan placed Rosie beside him and Lila in Arthur's chair. Rosie looked at the portrait above the fireplace and smiled. See, Mommy? She whispered. Grandpa saved your seat. Lila took Ethan's hand across the table, tears shining in her eyes. For the first time in her life, she did not feel like the maid standing outside a family's world. She felt like she had finally come home.